Tim, what can you tell us about Steve Angeli, and how helpful is looking at Notre Dame film to know what he can do for Syracuse?
Yeah, it's as helpful as it can be, in terms of watching, some Notre Dame tape. Offense is a little bit different, in terms of what Syracuse does versus Notre Dame. But yeah, you can see the mannerisms, obviously, some of the throws that he's made, some of the poise that he's played with. So that's the only reference we have, and we're just kind of projecting, what we think it'll look like, obviously, with Syracuse. So Syracuse did a tremendous job last year, as everybody knows. I mean, they threw the ball extremely well. Systematically, they did a lot of good things, to give their quarterback some easy reads, and, those guys were super productive. So I think this kid will fall in line, very similar to what it looked like last year, and, obviously we got to be ready to go to try to counter it.
Ryan, back left.
Where are you seeing Jalen McMurray grow in the last year, and what's your comfortability level with what he can do at Star right now?
Yeah, man, we're super excited about McMurray. He's always been a pro's pro. He's the first one in, last one out type of guy. His leadership skills are off the charts. We love him. We're extremely hopeful, that he'll be able to take his game to another level based on everything that we saw in the spring, everything that we've seen in camp to this point. So we're excited for him. I think the versatility he has playing star, playing corner. He's super smart, and he has really good cover skills. So we think he's poised for a monster year.
Coach, what's something you think you've learned about your defense since you guys started camp as you go into the opener?
Yeah, I think just the youth and enthusiasm that we have. Obviously we've lost, some parts, some production. But the thing that I'm super excited about is just the youth. These guys are young, but they're hungry. We're extremely athletic in a lot of spots. Obviously you don't know exactly until you get going, and we'll find out a little bit more this Saturday. But, everything they've done since spring, since the camp, leads me to believe that these guys in the moment won't be too big for them.
What have you liked about Colton Hood during this offseason?
Oh, very much like Mac, just the tenacity that he plays with. He's a kid that, has the ability to play inside for us on some spots. He's a physical corner. He's strong. He's been everything that we hoped he would be. So I think he's poised as well for a monster year. Obviously we didn't get him to the fall, but, he's really fit in with our culture. He's hardworking. I can't really say enough about him. We're excited for him. And like I said, the versatility that he brings, really gives us a chance to utilize his whole skill set.
Rob, then Ellie.
Coach, specifically with Jordan and Caleb on the edges, what steps have they made as you kind of look to replace James's production?
Yeah, I think, with Ross, just the overall confidence. He's stronger. He's another year in our system. You can see how much stronger he's gotten, and you see it in his play speed. Caleb Herring, we've always thought the world of Caleb. He's healthy now. He's had a really good, summer, in a fall camp. So I think just both of those guys, they're long, they're athletic. Obviously James, did a lot of great things for us, but we think those guys will be in the same mode, in terms of production.
The week one stories are out there with Fran Brown naming his quarterback. As you focus and prepare on the game, just what is one thing you're preaching to your defense?
Yeah, I think, just every day, just our fundamentals and who we are. Obviously we're getting ready for Syracuse, but at the end of the day, it's us against us. How we go about our business, how we prepare, how do we live to our standard, playing tough, playing smart, being relentless in everything we do. So, obviously as we get closer to the game, this week, we concentrate a little bit more on Syracuse, but, it'll be the same thing week in and week out. It's more about how we execute and how we go about our business than necessarily the opponent.
Tim, how much different is preparing for this game than kind of any other game throughout the year? Because you, especially in this era where there's so many new starters, so many transfers, all these things, it's like you've got all this time during the summer, but you also maybe don't know exactly what the other team's going to be throwing at you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first game is always different, because you don't know what kind of adjustments they've made, what they're doing differently. And then you combine that with, a lot of different faces and, how they're going to fit in, to the scheme. So I think that leads back into, my statement earlier, man, it's more about us, and how we, understand where we need to be within the framework of our defense, because it's always going to be the unknown. That's what first games are like. But vice versa. We've had some some time to really, develop, some different things that we wanted to do to put guys in different spots. So it's always a chess match, if you will. But at the end of the day, we'll always lean back on our training, how we execute.
You kind of touched on Syracuse having the success they had last season. I know a lot of personnel is different, but what stylistically, schematically, why were they so good, and how do they kind of stress defenses?
Yeah, they do a really good job of pushing the ball, downfield, with the RPO concepts, it's been really productive for them last year. I thought the wideouts, were vertical, those guys could get by you in a second, and then you combine it with a really strong run game. So you really didn't see a weakness, in terms of how they went about their business offensively. Really good scheme, really had good players to execute it. That's obviously a recipe for success. So we don't know how much the scheme will change. I think those guys had great success and great confidence in it, and then it'll be up to those new guys, obviously, to execute at the level they executed last year. But, we see a good offense every day in practice ourselves, and, we know we'll have our work cut out against those guys, but I know our guys are up for the challenge and can't wait to, tee this thing up.
When you look back at when you first got here, how proud, and can you talk about the growth from a talent standpoint in the back end, like where you all are from a depth standpoint now than maybe when you first got here, 5 years ago?
Yeah, we're forever grateful for those guys that decided to stay and, and work with us, but obviously we took a hit on depth, for a lot of different reasons, so to kind of see how the program has grown, the guys we've been able to develop in the program and recruit, it's been rewarding. I think when you're at a place like Tennessee, this is an attractive place, that people want to be, and we've been very fortunate to be able to recruit a lot of good talent back there, and not just there, but all over our team, from offense at, different spots and defensively up front and linebackers. So I just think the program has grown from night and day from the first year we've got here to where we are now.
It felt like last year you were comfortable playing 4 safeties. How many do you want to play this year, and are you there yet here for week 1?
Yeah, I think it's, you get what you deserve, in our defense. That's kind of our mantra. In a perfect world, you like to play as many guys as you can. We feel really good about a rotation that we develop, whether that's 3, whether that's 4, we'll find out Saturday. But we're definitely building, to be able to have some depth, to be able to, and not just safety, but corner, to linebacker, to D-line. We're trying to sustain our depth, and the only way to do that is to be able to play some young guys that, have earned it during the course of camp, and obviously we'll find out Saturday.
Last 2, Rob and Paige.
Coach, when you just talked about kind of the unknowns of preparing for the first game, and how much confidence does it give you to have guys like veterans like Arion or T-Lander that if something comes up and you got to shift gears in the middle of the game, you can do that?
Yeah, it's definitely, a little bit of a safety net for us. The linebackers, they steer the drink, so to speak. Those guys are like extensions of us as coaches, being able to communicate to the front and to the back end. I think Coach Jans has done a really good job with those guys and with their development. So yeah, I think being able to make some live adjustments, if need be, whether it's the second series, third series, first quarter, halftime, I think those guys will be up for the challenge just because of the experience that they've played with and the way they've earned it, the way they go about their business during camp. Absolutely.
With Ricky Gibson, I know you were talking earlier about just how Syracuse likes to stretch the field or push the ball down the field. How much are you relying on him to maybe handle the responsibility of that room, knowing it's a little injured, and for him to build off of what he did last season?
Well, I think, for Ricky, Ricky's grown, he's stronger, he's a, third year, I think, in our program, so we're obviously expecting a lot out of him just in general. I think he's really taken ownership to be even more vocal within that room. We do have some youth there. But yeah, we expect Ricky to pick up where he left off, last season. He's had a really good camp. Obviously when you're good at corner, it sets the table for everything else you want to do defensively. And Ricky's a big part of us being able to do that.
Thank you, Coach.
All right.